What was the cost of milk or eggs 100 years ago?
I think maybe it was 50 cents to $1 at the most.
Actually, in 1915, a gallon of milk cost 34 cents and a carton of eggs cost 18 cents.
What was the minimum wage about 100 years ago?
Maybe 50 cents.
In 1938, the U.S. minimum wage is 25 cents an hour.
What was the life expectancy 100 years ago?
60 or 70 years because they didn't have medicine like we have today.
In 1900s, the average life expectancy for an American man was 48.3. The average life expectancy for a woman was 51.1.
What percent of homes had a bathtub 100 years ago?
Probably going to say about 2%.
Only 14% of homes in the United States had a bathtub.
Wow.
Hey Will, 100 years ago, what do you think was a leading cause of death?
It was probably diseases like the flu and different plagues.
Actually, in 1915, the leading causes of death were influenza, pneumonia, and tuberculosis.
What was the cost of milk or eggs about 100 years ago?
50 cents.
In 1915, a dozen eggs cost 34 cents, a gallon of milk cost 18 cents, and a pound of coffee cost 30 cents.
What was the minimum wage about 100 years ago?
$20.
In 1938, the U.S. set its first minimum wage at 25 cents an hour.
How long do you think people lived 100 years ago?
About age 50.
For a man, 48.3, and for a woman, 51.1.
What was the speed limit 100 years ago?
10.
The maximum speed limit in most cities were 10 miles an hour.
Where were people born 100 years ago?
In barn.
More than 95% of all births in the United States took place at home.
100 years ago, what do you think was the leading cause of death?
Probably war.
In 1915, the three leading causes of death in the U.S. were heart disease, pneumonia, influenza, and tuberculosis.
Where were people born 100 years ago?
Maybe out in the middle of nowhere or in a cave or something.
More than 95% of all births in the U.S. took place at home.
What was the main mode of transportation 100 years ago?
I say that it would be like little rock cars, like the Flintstones used to have.
Horse and buggies were commonplace. They doubled as both transportation and work.
How many types of cars do you think there were 100 years ago?
Not very many, because I thought that they traveled with on horses.
There were essentially only one type of car, the Model T, and barely anyone drove.
What was the life expectancy 100 years ago?
Maybe only like 85 or something. Around
In the 1900s, for an American man was 48 years. The average life expectancy for a woman was 51 years.
What was the most common job about 100 years ago?
People worked on a farm.
In 1910, agriculture was the most common industry. Americans worked in. By 1920, it had been surpassed by manufacturing. Today, it's service jobs.
What was the cost of milk or eggs about 100 years ago?
It was probably very cheap, like a nickel or penny or something like that.
In 1915, a dozen eggs cost 34 cents, a gallon of milk cost 18 cents, and a pound of coffee cost 30 cents.
What do you think the speed limit was 100 years ago?
Maybe like 30 miles per hour.
Fun fact, the speed limit was only about 10.
Dang.
What would you do if you were sick 100 years ago? I would go to the hospital and let the nurse and doctors take blood and prescribe medicine. Your doctors might prescribe leeches and penicillin. Describe way.
What was different about the restrooms in our homes 100 years ago?
I remember they're probably like outside instead of like actual plumbing inside.
In 1940, just 75 years ago, when the census collected information on the plumbing in American homes, almost half lacked the trifecta of cold hot water, a tub or shower, and a flush toilet.
What was the minimum wage about 100 years ago?
I think 32 cents.
In 1938, the U.S. set its first minimum wage to 25 cents an hour.
How many types of cars do you think there was 100 years ago?
I don't think there were any that used horses.
There was essentially only one type of car, the Model T, and barely anybody drove.
What did you do if you were sick 100 years ago?
I probably would have died or probably got some medicine.
Your doctors might have prescribed bloodletting, aka leeches. Penicillin was still a decade away.
What was the cost of milk or eggs about 100 years ago?
I'd probably say about maybe like a week or something, piece of wheat or something like that.
In 1915, a dozen eggs cost 34 cents, a gallon of milk cost 18 cents, and a pound of coffee cost 30 cents. It's cheap.
What percent of homes had a bathtub 100 years ago?
Maybe about 20%.
Actually, only 14% of homes in the United States had a bathtub.
Wow.
100 years ago, what did you think was the leading cause of death?
I would probably have to say not having medicine when you're sick, and then you have to go on your own.
In 1915, the three leading causes of death in the U.S. were heart disease, pneumonia, influenza, and tuberculosis.
If someone wanted to order the newest trend or fashion, how did they get it?
They would like tell a friend and then ask them to go get it.
Letters and parcels were largely mailed by trains, trucks, or even motorcycles. The first airmail ever sent was in May 1918.
What did you do if you were sick 100 years ago? Go to the doctor. Your doctors might prescribe bloodletting, achleaches, or achleaches. Penicillin was still a decade away.
What is the minimum wage about 100 years ago?
100 years ago, I would want to say 20 to 30 cents.
It says in 1938, the U.S. set its first minimum wage at 25 cents an hour.
All right.
What percent of homes had a bathtub 100 years ago? Only 14% of the homes in the United States had a bathtub.
Where were people born 100 years ago?
I think they were born in their houses because I don't think there were hospitals back then.
More than 95% of all births in the United States took place at home.
What was the speed limit 100 years ago?
I don't know, 10 miles an hour?
The maximum speed limit in most cities was 10 miles per hour.